Imagine a job so desirable that women fought each other for the chance to get hired. Top pay. Glamorous reputation. Some of the best working conditions available to women at the time. Now imagine that same job was slowly disintegrating their jawbones from the inside, one paintbrush stroke at a time. This isn't a mining disaster. It's not a war. It's a watch factory. And the women who worked there were called, quite literally, the Radium Girls. To understand why women fought to get this job, you have to understand how radium was viewed at the time. When Marie and Pierre Curie discovered it in 1898, it wasn't feared, it was celebrated as a miracle substance. Radium was marketed in toothpaste, cosmetics, tonics, and even chocolate, all promising vitality and health benefits. If a new form of radiation could shrink tumors, the public reasoning went, then a little exposure every day must be good for you. So when watch companies began hiring young women to hand-paint glow-in-the-dark numerals onto watch, clock, and military instrument dials, using radium-laced paint, it wasn't seen as a health risk. It was seen as an opportunity. And it really was an opportunity. Dial painters were among the top 5% of female earners in the country at the time, and could make significantly more than women in typical factory jobs, enough that the position was considered genuinely prestigious for working-class women. There was even a strange kind of glamour to it. The women would leave work coated in fine radium dust, glowing faintly in the dark. Some wore their best dresses to work just so the fabric would shimmer when they went out dancing afterward. Here's the detail that turned this dream job into a death sentence. The paintbrushes used to paint the tiny numerals would lose their fine point after just a few strokes. And factory supervisors had a simple solution for keeping them sharp: lip, dip, paint. Workers were taught to shape the bristles with their lips or tongue, then dip the brush in radium paint, then paint the dial, over and over, hundreds of times per shift. Each of those tiny touches introduced a small amount of radium directly into their mouths. When workers occasionally asked whether this was safe, supervisors and company representatives assured them there was nothing to worry about, even though internal industry knowledge about radium's dangers was already growing. Believing it was harmless, some workers even used the paint recreationally, painting their nails, their teeth, even their faces for fun before nights out, unknowingly increasing their exposure even further. For years, nothing seemed wrong. And then, starting around 1920, something did. The first symptoms showed up in dentists' offices. Dial painters began arriving with severe tooth pain. Dentists pulled the affected teeth, a routine fix for typical dental problems. Except the sockets didn't heal. Instead, the surrounding bone began to die, a condition that came to be known as radium jaw, where the jawbone would gradually disintegrate, sometimes to the point that it could be lifted away from the skull entirely. Alongside the jaw necrosis came severe anemia, spontaneous bone fractures, and in many cases, aggressive cancers. These were young, otherwise healthy women in their late teens and 20s, and doctors were completely baffled by what was killing them. It took years of investigation before a pathologist named Dr. Harrison Martland developed a test proving conclusively what was happening. Radium, ingested through years of lip, dip, paint, was accumulating inside the women's bones, acting as a permanent internal source of radiation, slowly destroying them from within. By 1927, more than 50 dial painters had died. And by then, the pattern was undeniable: this wasn't bad luck. It was the job itself. Here's where the story gets even more infuriating. The company at the center of it, U.S. Radium Corporation, knew. Their own commissioned studies in the early 1920s had already concluded that the lack of safety precautions was putting workers in danger, and they suppressed that information, publicly denying any connection between the illnesses and their factories. When one hired researchers' investigation confirmed the workers were contaminated and their blood abnormal, the company allegedly rewrote portions of that report to falsely reassure the public before it was published. In 1927, 5 surviving dial painters, Grace Fryer, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, Albina Larice, and Edna Hussman, decided to fight back, filing a lawsuit against U.S. Radium Corporation. It took 2 years just to find a lawyer willing to take the case against such a powerful defendant. By the time the case reached trial in 1928, all 5 women were gravely ill. Some couldn't lift their arms high enough to take the courtroom oath. Fearing they wouldn't survive a lengthy trial, they ultimately accepted an out-of-court settlement rather than risk running out of time. A decade later, another dial painter, Catherine Wolfe Donahue, testified from her sickbed in a separate case against a different radium company. She died the day after her employer's attorneys filed their next appeal, but her case, and the others before it, permanently changed how companies could be held responsible for worker safety. Here's the lasting legacy of the Radium Girls. Their case became one of the first in American history where a company was held legally responsible for the long-term health of its employees, directly contributing to the development of modern occupational disease law. Decades later, when the Manhattan Project was designing radiation safety protocols for the scientists building the atomic bomb, they modeled their precautions directly on the radium dial factories. The hard-won lessons from these women's suffering literally helped protect the next generation of workers handling radioactive material. And here's a genuinely eerie detail: radium has a half-life of roughly 1,600 years. Some of the women who died from this exposure are, quite literally, still faintly radioactive in their graves today, a century later. They weren't miners risking cave-ins. They weren't soldiers risking bullets. They were young women who took what looked like the best job available to them, and paid for it with their lives, before eventually forcing an entire industry to change. So let's put it together. Radium dial painting looked like the ideal job for young working-class women: high pay, glamorous reputation, and considered completely safe. The lip-dip paint technique meant workers were unknowingly ingesting radium hundreds of times a shift. Years later, that exposure caused radium jaw, anemia, bone fractures, and cancer in dozens of young women. And when the company denied responsibility, a small group of dying women fought back in court and won, permanently changing workplace safety law. The deadliest job in history didn't look dangerous at all. That's exactly what made it so deadly. If this story hit differently than you expected, that's exactly the kind of history you were never taught. Content I make videos about every week, so if you haven't already, subscribe. Here's a question for the comments: what other job in history do you think looked completely safe on the surface but was secretly deadly? Drop it below. I read every comment, and the best one might become the next video on this channel. Thanks for watching. Which part of this surprised you the most? Let me know below, and if you want more forgotten history like this, subscribe, there's a lot more coming.